Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party's candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate, organize around the eco socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So today is one day after the anniversary of the Russian invasion or full scale invasion of Ukraine. And I haven't really prepared any thoughts about it. I just got off a podcast that had two Ukrainians, one Russian, all them socialists, Kavita Krishnan from India, uh, and then Bill Fletcher, who's an American activist, talking about, what's going on in Ukraine and, how we can provide solidarity with the people of Ukraine in this time. I had, along with a number of other people, a 1 minute pre recorded solidarity statement. And, what I said was, I'm speaking for myself. I can't speak for the Green Party because it's divided right down the middle on the question of solidarity with the Ukrainian resistance to Russia's imperialist invasion, which to me is kind of shocking. As I said in that solidarity statement, it shouldn't even be a question that we support the right of oppressed nations to self-determination and self-defense. And it shouldn't even be a question that they have the right to get arms from wherever they can get them. But that's where we're at. So I spoke for myself, and I'm going to or ask Anna, who's filling in for Chris today, to put in the chat a link to that podcast. That it's still going on. I'm not asking you to switch over there. It's recorded, and you can look at it anytime. And I put in the description. It's a statement from Yulia Yushchenko, which is right at the beginning, which I thought, it's the Ukraine Solidarity Network. That's who's putting on this podcast. But the first link I put up there, it says Yulia Yushchenko, and it goes to the podcast. There you go. And she made a very powerful off-the-cuff statement at a demonstration in London that was going on today in solidarity with the Ukrainians, and they were together with Iranians, calling for solidarity with that struggle for freedom and democracy in Iran or Iran. I'll never get that right. So I just, if you just can spend a few minutes, go to that podcast and just listen to Yulia Yushchenko. I thought it was an amazing statement, considering she did it, on the street, and her production values were better than mine because I did it right here. They wanted it with a cell phone, and anyway, further down in that podcast, you can see what I had to say. So I just found it, incredible that there are people that equate the national liberation of Ukraine with a victory for NATO and Western imperialism, which to me means people can't tell the difference between a war of aggression by Russia or U.S. imperialist aggression in, many places around the world right now. For example, we're sending military aid to Israel as it goes into the West Bank, kills about a person a day. They killed 11 this week in one raid, or almost as much money as we're sending to Ukraine. We're sending to the Saudis and the Emiratis for their, devastating war in Yemen. I could go around the world, and we got to oppose that too. But then some people take the position, which I think is basically reactionary, that we should oppose arms to the Ukrainians for their national liberation because NATO's doing it and we oppose NATO. That is not what socialist solidarity should mean. It's not in the green tradition of international solidarity. We're in solidarity with the oppressed and the people fighting for their rights, for their freedoms, and against foreign occupation. So I'm just still kind of astounded that people buy that. And why do they buy it? Well, Russia has put out this narrative that it's not invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but it's self-defense by Russia from NATO. They call it, uh, the U.S. war on Russia rather than Russia's war on Ukraine. And if you think about it for a minute, it's hard to believe that people buy that, but it's maybe understandable in another sense because U.S. imperialism has been so vicious, so many places around the world in the last couple of decades that people just think, well, if that's what the U.S. is doing, I'm opposed because they're always wrong. But that disrespects the Ukrainian people, the oppressed people. I think it's just Western chauvinism, American exceptionalism to say we can decide what's going on in Ukraine and what should happen to Ukrainian people rather than what they say. And what they say is that we want Russian troops out. We want our own country back. And it's not just across the spectrum, it's particularly on the left, the progressive social movements, the Party of Greens, the Democratic Socialist Organization Sotsialny Ruch, which translates into the social movement, feminists, environmentalists, LGBTQ people. They all say, we want Russia out and we want arms so we can defend ourselves. And what's missing, I think, in most of these discussions we're having on the ideological left in the US and in the peace movement is listening to those voices in Ukraine. They have a right to determine how they're going to fight for their freedom. And I think we should listen to them. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. I know a lot of other things going on in the news, but this, I think, is a central issue, not only for world peace, but for the future of the left. If the left can't stand in solidarity with oppressed peoples are going to look somewhere else for allies. And that's not good for the international left. Brandon Gill, I'm all for the emulation of the conflict with Ukraine and Russia, as well as supporting the Ukrainian people. When it comes down to the reason we are supplying them, it isn't because of virtue. Yeah, but we should answer to the Ukrainian people. The U.S. has, at best, mixed motives, of course. And, U.S., what we have here is behind the Ukrainian struggle for liberation is an inter-imperialist competition between Russian and Western imperialism over who will be able to exploit Ukraine. They're both capitalist camps, and they both have interests in Ukraine being open to their exploitation. But that's not the end of the story. And you got to start with what the Ukrainian people say. And they say, and especially the left says, but I think everybody in Ukraine pretty much is saying this, we can fight for what we want in Ukraine against exploitation much better under the flawed but relatively open Ukrainian democracy than under Russian occupation, which has been brutal and totally repressive. So, yeah, I don't think the motives of U.S. leaders are not without problems. But the question is, what do the Ukrainian people fighting for their liberation want? And we should support their struggle for liberation. And if that means they get arms from NATO, so be it. Where else are they going to get them from? I mean, think back, a lot of people like to refer to Lenin, who, was calling for the right of nations to self-determination at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. And he favorably repeated and commented on Karl Liebknecht's famous leaflet, "The main enemy is at home." This is when the radical left was not taking a side in World War I. They were saying, as Lenin said, let's turn this World War into a civil war. In other words, a struggle for revolution. And so, yeah, the main enemy is at home, but they weren't saying that the only enemy is at home, because they opposed the imperialism on all sides, not just their own countryside. And in struggling for Russian liberation And against the czars, Lenin first took money and got safe passage through Germany from the German Kaiser, an imperialist power. But they took that so they could get back to Russia as the revolution was beginning. And then later on, after they had taken the power in Russia, they asked the French and the British for money and arms to fight the German imperialists who were still attacking Russia. And Lenin, I remember reading about a note he sent to the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks. He couldn't be at the meeting, but they were debating whether they should even ask these imperialists for support. And Lenin said something like, I send my vote in favor of getting arms and potatoes, money and other material support from the, I think he said, French Anglo bandits. So in other words, you can't say because U.S. imperialism has a lot of things wrong, Ukrainian people shouldn't accept arms from them. I mean, what do you think is going to happen if Ukraine can't fight back? You think Russia's going to say, oh, the war's over, we stop? I mean, just yesterday, Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president for an interim period when Putin became prime minister and then he switched back again. I call him Putin's mini-me, who has become one of the most belligerent, basically genocidal toward the Ukrainians. He just said yesterday that the Russians are going to take over Ukraine all the way to the Polish border. So if the Ukrainians don't have arms to defend themselves, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to be the recolonization of Ukraine, which spent 2.5 centuries under occupation and colonization and oppression from Moscow. So we got to start with the oppressed and what they need, and then how they handle their strategy and tactics with relation to the imperialist powers is something we got to respect, because they're on the ground, they know what they need, and our role is to be in solidarity. Rachel Mohan, why do you think the Greens are so focused on our involvement in Ukraine and so silent on the proxy war in Yemen? I think that's an excellent question. And you could say the same thing about military aid to Israel or military cooperation with Morocco, which is occupying Western Sahara, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. And, there are other places. I think we could be saying something about the U.S. meddling in the Iranian freedom struggle. It's not only that the U.S. is, expressing support, but they're trying to pick who the leaders are going to be. There's a group called MEQ. It's MEQ. It's kind of a cultish mix of Marxism and Islamist thought that the U.S. has been supporting for a long time. And they're not popular in Iran. And, we should stay the hell out of that. We should provide moral support, but not get involved in the internal politics of the opposition movement in Iran. That's up to the Iranians. So, yes, there are all kinds of struggles we should be raising. Also, the disarmament question. This war in Ukraine, the Russians have been rattling their nuclear sabers repeatedly. And the question is, what that should prompt really is pushing to the top of the agenda nuclear disarmament. The U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty under George W. Bush. Under Trump, they unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as the Open Skies Treaty, which was a way for all sides to observe each other's troop movements. And now Russia has suspended participation in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So we're in a real bad position. The U.S. initiated a nuclear arms modernization program under Obama, which has kicked off a nuclear arms race with Russia and China modernizing their forces as well and increasing their forces in the case of China. So, why has, it's been the Green Peace Action Committee. It's a national committee of the of the Green Party. They focused completely on Ukraine and nothing else this year on all the other issues going on. So I think that's an important question. And there's lots of demands we should be making as Greens and a peace movement uh, that seem to have got kicked to the side during this Ukraine war. So I think that's a good question. Putin has suspended the nuclear weapons treaty with the US. While I still have it on wait and see, this could spell terrible news down the line. Yeah, it could. Um, I hope it's just a gesture by Putin, kind of a hostile message to the U.S. And he's trying to deter the U.S. from providing arms to the Ukrainian resistance. But it's something I think the U.S. should, with very public diplomacy, be demanding not only get back into the discussion about modernizing the START treaty, which is where they're at now, but getting back to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty. I mean, the U.S., basically after Bush suspended our participation, we put anti-ballistic missile bases in Poland and Romania, which Russia's worried, could be converted to missiles that would strike Russia, from an even closer place than, say, a submarine in the Baltic Sea. We're kind of back to the situation, and then Russia's saying we're going to put nukes in Kaliningrad, which is right up against Germany, and it's a kind of exclave of Russia and in Belarus. So we're getting back to where we were in the 1980s when these intermediate range missiles on both the Western and Russian or Soviet side at that time, they were practically touching each other nose to nose. So, the nuclear war would be incinerating cities with those intermediate range nuclear forces within minutes. And when that's the case, the nukes are supposed to be a deterrent. But if you're worried that you wouldn't have time to launch your nukes because the other side's nukes would be launched first and wipe yours out, you put yourself on a hair trigger alert, and the radar may register birds migrating, and you think it's a Russian, or the U.S. would think, or in fact the Russians thought the U.S. was doing that when they were doing war games one time in 1983, and they were getting ready to launch. We've been very close. So what I'm saying is we're in a nuclear arms crisis like we haven't seen since the 1980s, and that should push nuclear disarmament to the top of the agenda. And the U.S. with a different policy could be urging that, and publicly saying with the Russians, we want to talk about these things, and also could take unilateral initiatives to help create a basis for that. We could declare no first use of nuclear weapons. The Chinese have that policy. We could, decommission our our intercontinental nuclear missiles, our ICBMs. They are really just a target. We don't need them for deterrence. We can use the submarine launched and the air launched, bomber jet launched nukes as a deterrent. What they are as a target. And they, in particular, are susceptible to a first strike, which puts them on hair trigger alert, and they might get launched by mistakenly thinking they see a first strike, or by accident, or even rogue commanders. One of the things that is of high concern is that there are tactical nukes in the field in Europe. And at the commander level, I know this is on the NATO side, they can launch those without it coming from the president and the keys they got to press in the football they carry around. So there is a lot of we're in a very dangerous period, and I think we need to be demanding that the U.S. get serious about nuclear disarmament. Richard Pink, what does a Ukrainian victory look like, and how can it be achieved without triggering World War III? I've asked this question over and over, and no one will touch it. A Ukrainian victory looks like Russian troops out of Ukraine. Now, how that happens, it could be the Ukrainian military forces them out. It could be in the background. There are, negotiations between uh, the U.S. and NATO on one side and Russia on the other. They get to the security concerns that Russia raised um, that are legitimate. If we had a green government in Russia, they would be concerned about those ABM uh, sites in Romania and Poland. Um, and the NATO has expanded eastward, uh, and it seems hostile to Ukraine. What we could negotiate are um, security arrangements that include Russia across Europe. Um, and in that case, if we are making progress on that, Putin could decide, this war is costing me too much, but I can say I won my security objectives if they can come to that kind of mutual security agreement, like Gorbachev, right after the nuclear arms control treaties, was saying, now we need to negotiate security arrangements for a common European home that includes, from the Urals to the Atlantic Ocean, from Russia across Europe. And unfortunately, particularly under Bill Clinton as president, the U.S. wasn't interested in that and only interested in expanding NATO's jurisdiction. So it's understandable why Russia's concerned about that. I think if we address those background issues, it would create a way for Putin to pull out that's politically acceptable within Russia. Not to everyone. They have a very ultra nationalist right wing that's very pushing, basically, rebuilding the old Russian Empire, uh, covering all the space that the Soviet Empire covered. It's a problem, but so in the end, it's going to have to be negotiations, and it's going to have to be negotiations about mutual security between Russia and Ukraine. That will be acceptable to Ukraine. What they have proposed is, a treaty signed by Russia, by other big powers in the West, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity and that it won't be attacked. And actually, that was on paper. It was a memorandum, not a treaty, called the Budapest Memorandum, and that was what enabled the world to have Ukraine uh, give up the nukes that it uh, inherited from the Soviet Union, and they were given to Russia, and a lot of them decommissioned under the other nuclear disarmament treaties. And in return, Russia and the U.S. and other Western powers said, we will protect uh, and defend Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, obviously, that's been broken by Russia. But that's the kind of agreement that the Ukrainians want. And, it should be mutual so that the Russians are assured, Ukraine is not going to, be a host to, military forces that could attack Russia. And so I think that's how it ends. When it gets to the negotiating table is difficult. I think it's encouraging that the Chinese have said, although their 12-point proposal isn't very specific, they said they want to negotiate it. They definitely have told the Russians, don't dare use nuclear weapons. So they may end up playing a constructive role here in encouraging Russia to come to the negotiating table. But in the meantime, both sides are pressing to the military struggle, and that's where it's at right now. What is my basic position on foreign policy and the CIA, et cetera? Well, my basic position is that we should have deep cuts. I called on the order of 75% immediately. And by immediately, I mean it would take a few years, but that would be the goal. So we have a home-based defense of U.S. territory. And whatever else there is would be deployed overseas with the authorization of the United Nations for peacekeeping and preventing genocide and things like that. Um, Now, that also means that I support reforming the United Nations so that you don't have five imperialist powers having veto over what the UN can do in terms of peacekeeping. It needs to be democratized. Um, I think also going back to what the settlement looks like in Ukraine, I think a UN authorized peacekeeping force uh, will be necessary to uh, monitor the border, and also if uh, Donbass and Crimea come back under Ukrainian jurisdiction, that there are not reprisals that are illegitimate against people who collaborated with the Russian occupation. Um, if they committed crimes in that collaboration, that should be, brought through the criminal justice system, not, abuse of those people just because you took control of the territory. So, and what else about foreign policy? Uh, I think we should be opposed to, imperialism. First of all, by the U.S. itself, which means stopping the, support for the Saudis and Emiratis in Yemen, for example, or the Israelis on the West Bank, or the Israelis, apparently striking Iran, which they wouldn't have done without the U.S., at least saying behind the scenes, okay. Uh, Israel, frequently, almost weekly, uh, striking Iranian military targets. I'm eventually going to learn how to say Iran correctly. Iranian military targets in Syria, which they do with the complicity of both the U.S. and Russia. Uh, which brings up the point that there's not just one imperialism in the world, U.S. imperialism. There are a number of imperialisms. They have different strengths, but they not only compete, they also cooperate. And in this case, the the Russians, like the U.S., are cooperating with Israel, which is imperialist, at least toward Palestinian territories, uh, and allowing it into that airspace which they control. The U.S. on the eastern side of Syria and the Russians on the western side, and the Israelis couldn't make those strikes if they weren't notifying that the Russians or the Americans, depending on where it was, where they were going to strike. And the Russians and the Americans don't strike back; they just let those strikes go ahead. Which is to say that the U.S. has got to pull back from its uh, cooperation with sub-imperialist powers like Israel. We need to withdraw our military progressively from over 800 foreign military bases. I think it needs to be a process rather than a sudden pullout. You leave a political vacuum, and other bad actors are going to try to step in and take advantage of people they can, oppress and exploit. The disarmament initiatives I mentioned, I think, beyond just decommissioning the ICBMs, we should, reduce our total nuclear uh, capability to a minimum credible deterrent, but quickly move toward, uh, disarmament negotiations with the goal of getting rid of all nuclear weapons, as this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which over 100 countries have signed, calls for. And the people that haven't signed, that haven't participated in that, are the 9 nuclear powers, including the U.S. The U.S., should change its nuclear posture, turn to a more defensive posture, and use those changes in policy as a basis for challenging the other nuclear powers to get into this process of global total nuclear disarmament. So, and the CIA should collect intelligence, shouldn't do covert operations. So there's a lot more to say on that, but let's get to another question so I don't just keep talking about that one. BD Dimmitt, I wonder, after listening back to some of the 2022 sessions, what new insights or what events caused you to change your view regarding, as a representative example, the term proxy war, which you used in reference to the fighting back then. I'm not demanding justification, but I'm simply curious. Yeah, as the war was, before the war was launched, I was critical of the U.S. Supplying. They had a batch of arms they were sending in the late fall or early 2022 that I thought, was escalating the tensions. And I was, I know Putin had amassed, all those troops on the Ukrainian border, but I thought that was a statement, not that they would invade, because it would be such a blatant imperialist invasion in violation of the UN Charter. It's a war of aggression, which is a supreme war crime. I thought it was posturing. And so I thought the US shouldn't, escalate tensions. It should, keep trying to negotiate. So, and if I said proxy, I said, maybe I said at that time that, the US was uh, using the Ukrainians as a proxy against Russia, but that was before the invasion of Russia, the full scale invasion. So, I think it's wrong to call, as some on the left in the peace movement do, the war in Ukraine a U.S. proxy war against Russia. It just takes the Ukrainians out of the picture, which is, you know, uh, you know, U.S. or American centrism and chauvinism. As if the Ukrainian people don't count. So I think, to call it a proxy war is to excuse Russia's invasion. It absolves them of responsibility. It makes it sound like uh, Russia invaded Ukraine because the U.S. tricked them into it or pushed them into it. Um, there were issues to be resolved. They could have been resolved diplomatically, not with an attempt at military resolution, which is really, and on the part of Russia, an attempt to recolonize Ukraine. And that has to be opposed. So uh, I think, yeah, I know I did oppose the U.S. arms to Ukraine before the war broke out because I thought it would escalate tensions. I don't know if I used the term proxy war then, but um, now it's it's the Ukrainians' own agency, what they want that counts, and let them deal with the problems of Russian imperialism, which is manifest primarily militarily now, but also Western imperialism. The Ukrainian left has been fighting the neoliberal labor and economic policies of the Zelensky government. And, all they will tell you is that we can fight that much more readily under the more open democracy of Ukraine than under the jackboots of a Russian occupation. Amy L. Sachs, unfortunately, there's no way to support NATO without supporting U.S. imperialism and profiteering and our own continued endangerment and impoverishment. I'm talking about supporting the Ukrainian people. NATO is, as I advocated earlier, it should be replaced by you know, security arrangements that include Russia and encompass Europe. Um, so, was Lenin wrong to take money and get safe passage through Germany from the German Kaiser? Or did that, mean he was supporting German imperialism? I think you need a more nuanced analysis than to just say, whatever NATO does, we got to take the opposite position. Was NATO wrong to participate in the UN authorized military intervention in Kuwait after Iraq tried to annex Kuwait? I think you got to look at each situation rather than having a simple answer to every conflict. Nikitschka, Howie Hawkins, how do you keep the people from bombing the Donbass? I assume you're talking about Ukraine bombing military targets in Donbass. Well, Russia could pull back the troops and then the bombing in the Donbass would stop. Russia could pull back the troops and stop bombing the parts of Donbass it doesn't control. Um, I think the answer is Russian troops out, and the bombing will stop. Do citizens of a state have the right to defend themselves from invasion? Yeah, that's what I'm arguing. Um, they have a right to self-defense. That is something that the left, socialists, Greens have traditionally defended. And as I said at the top, it's kind of astonishing that somehow people get confused and say the Ukrainians shouldn't get the arms they need to defend themselves, as if arms to the Ukrainians for self-defense is the same as arms uh, that say Iran is giving to Russia to bomb Ukraine. There's a difference between the violence of an aggressor and the violence and self-defense of people that are being invaded. Brant Gill, I agree with the overall message of supplying Ukraine throughout the conflict. I just also think the U.S. has been purposely escalating the conflict. Well, let's look at that. I think the U.S. has been slow to provide the arms that the Ukrainians have wanted. Russia, on the other hand, uh, they had their, what they call it, partial mobilization of 300,000 more troops to throw at Ukraine. They started using their missiles and drones to strike civilian infrastructure, trying to take out the power and light and water. That's a war crime. You're not supposed to attack, you're supposed to attack military targets, not civilian targets. It's something the US was blatantly guilty of in Iraq. And it certainly doesn't justify Russia doing it in Ukraine. I think, like getting Patriot missile defense, that's to defend Ukraine from these cruise missile strikes. The US was reluctant to provide that. And that's a defensive weapon. And people say that's escalating the conflict. I just don't buy that. I think, now the U.S. won't send fighter jets. The Abrams tanks it's sending reluctantly are not going to get there till next year. They're a small number, and we're really just something Germany wanted so they could send the Leopard tanks to Ukraine as political cover. So I don't think the U.S. has been purposely escalating the conflict. I think that's just not the correct analysis. I don't think that's what's going on. Roland Ra, Howie Hawkins, do you believe Washington should play world police and be telling everyone who is good and who is evil? No. I don't know what else to say. It's a kind of a leading question. I don't believe that. What is your position on BDS and the Israeli-Palestine solution? I support BDS. Right now we're getting a lot of rhetoric that sanctions are always bad. No, they're not. The sanctions against apartheid South Africa, which I worked on, from the time of the Soweto uprising in '76 until we got it in '85, I think had an effect on the apartheid regime deciding that apartheid is going to cost them too much and they got to get rid of it. Same thing with Israel. If the U.S. stopped, basically letting Israel do whatever it wants without any consequences from the U.S., Israel will keep doing it. We have, some leverage over Israel. We provide them with a lot of military aid. The what is it called? The National Palestinian BDS Committee, which started this whole idea of boycott, divestment, sanctions, calls on us to first target military aid to Israel until Israel recognizes the human and democratic rights of the Palestinian people and, gets serious about negotiating some kind of permanent settlement in that region. So I favor that. And, I would advocate that it be applied sequentially instead of all at once. So we start with cutting off military aid. And if that doesn't move Israel, then we apply other sanctions or divestments or boycotts. That way you can make a statement more than once. But the first thing is say, as long as you're doing what you're doing now in the West Bank and killing people and seizing land and pushing Palestinians out of their homes, we're cutting off the military aid. And, maybe that'll get their attention and we can push them to, stop being so oppressive toward the Palestinians. Petey Dimon, I would advocate replacing NATO with an unlimited coalition of nations cooperating to address problems that are facing the entire planet, including problems that fall outside our anthropocentric tunnel vision. Yeah, I think you're talking about what the United Nations aspired and should aspire to be. And that's why I think, part of our foreign policy agenda should be reforming the UN, democratizing it, giving the equal status that formally in law the smaller nations have. I don't have a specific reform proposal except to say that the Security Council as now constituted is not working because Russia will veto any action regarding Ukraine. The U.S. will veto any action regarding Israel, actions that would have overwhelming support of the nations of the world, and that's a problem. We gotta get beyond a world of superpowers and a world of equality and cooperation among nations. And the United Nations is a framework for that. So I think what you're advocating is a new United Nations that is democratized and functioning like it ought to. Scout Trooper 164. I heard somewhere that the hawks in office admit that Russia won't suffer total defeat against Ukraine. What do you think of this? I'm not sure I characterize them as the hawks. I think there is a faction from some of the reporting that is urging, for example, General Milley in a speech in New York, I think in December. And it's reported that the security advisor Sullivan went to both Zelensky and Putin saying, can we do a land for peace deal? Both sides told him to get lost at that point. But I think there is a faction in the national security and military and State Department establishment that is willing to push for early settlement. And that would include forcing the Ukrainians to give up land to Russia, which I think, we should oppose. It's not up to the Russians and the Americans to carve up Ukraine between them into spheres of influence, which is an imperialist concept. If you support spheres of influence, you support the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. gets to control, what goes on in Latin America. And then in return, this was Obama's position, he didn't react too much to the annexation of Crimea because he said, well, that's Russia's sphere of influence. It's not a vital interest of the U.S., so let them have it, which is tolerating aggression and imperialism. But that was U.S. policy. So I think, there's a faction in the U.S. government that will push for an early settlement, even if, and there are people in the peace movement that advocate this. Medea Benjamin, I've heard her say it several times, that the U.S. should use its leverage that it now has because of the economic and military aid it's given to Ukraine to force it into a land for peace deal. She says Ukraine will never get back any more land. Therefore, we got to force them to settle, which is basically saying the U.S. and the Russians should carve up Ukraine, which is an imperialist settlement. It's not a just settlement. It won't be an enduring settlement because the Ukrainian people have made clear. And there's a new poll just out. The Kyiv International Institute of Sociology has been polling Ukrainians on a number of questions related to the war, but one of them is is land for peace and acceptable settlement of the war. And the latest poll said 87% of the Ukrainians said no. And if you talk to Ukrainians, what they're concerned about is they have family and friends and compatriots who are under Russian occupation and suffering from this filtration process where, the Russians interrogate people, and if they're not sufficiently loyal to Russia, they may be detained. Some are tortured. There's rape. There's separation of children from their families, and other people, along with those children, are forcibly displaced to Russia, which is another war crime. The Ukrainians don't want to leave their friends, family, and compatriots under Russian occupation in the eastern Donbass or in Crimea, now in parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson. So, 87%. This poll just out a day or two ago. That's what they're thinking. So, forget what the original question was. It's off the board right now, but I think it was about negotiations and a settlement. And you have to realize. Oh no, whether I forget the question, but let's get to the next one. Here we go. The role of socialist internationalism. Well, socialist internationalism means solidarity among the socialist organizations with the oppressed and exploited in every country. It means solidarity among peoples, not states. What we have right now is too many people on the ideological left and parts of the peace movement influenced by them, is that they're aligned with states. Russian imperialism is a lesser evil to Western imperialism or U.S. imperialism. And that's where people derive the absurd conclusion that the national liberation of Ukraine would be a victory for Western imperialism. How much Western imperialism can penetrate and exploit Ukraine is up to the Ukrainians and how they organize, and the international socialist solidarity that supports those Ukrainians fighting for their political and economic rights and democracy. So you can't equate the victory of the Ukrainians with a victory for Western imperialism. How that works out depends on what the Ukrainians do. And what the Ukrainians will tell you. One thing we know for sure is we don't want to be under the military occupation of Russia. We'll deal with Western imperialism later. That's certainly what the left will tell you. And, I had that statement by Yulia Yushchenko posted earlier that she gave on this podcast earlier. She's a political economist. She wrote the book called Ukraine and the Empire Capital, From Marketization to Armed Conflict. And that book, is a critique of capitalist imperialism by both the West and the Russians. And, so people like her, she's in Sotsialny Ruch, the socialist organization in Ukraine. She and her comrades, as well as people in other social movements, environmentalists, Greens in particular, they understand that they want to get the Russian military out, but they don't want to be under the economic domination of the EU and the giant corporations from the West. So, we have to support the Ukrainians first, getting the Russians off their back, and secondly, dealing with how they're going to reconstruct their society. Is it going to be on a progressive, socialist, democratic basis, or on a neoliberal basis? And that's going to be a big struggle in Ukraine. The political parties that dominate, Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, Holos is another one. They're very neoliberal in orientation. They tend to represent the professional middle classes and the small capitalists who, want a neoliberal, deregulation, privatization, small public sector. and they're opposed by the labor movement and the socialists and the Greens and the anarchists and the feminists. But that's going to be a fight. But at least uh, that's a fight that the Ukrainians should have the right to determine for themselves. Reese is amazing. I heard Putin has a plan to invade Moldova this month. What do you think about this? Yeah, there's been talk of that. I think that's come from the Ukrainian side. I don't know if that is accurate. The Moldovan side has said they want to get Transnistria back, which is a slice of Moldova the Russians have occupied since the early 1990s. They have military forces there. So there's been talk that Moldova and maybe the Ukrainians coming from the other side of the border, going in and rooting out the Russians there. On the other side, there's talk that the Russians are going to use Moldova and the forces they have there as a launching base for this offensive we've been hearing about. But I don't know what to think about that. I mean, a lot of times, countries put out stuff like that for propaganda purposes, and it's hard to decipher. I think, the thing about Moldova, though, Putin had a plan. I mean, we've got that from, the orders captured, in areas like around Kyiv in the original invasion, and in Kherson, and in Kharkiv, where they captured soldiers or equipment and found what their orders were, and the plan was for Russia, not only take a land base that they've taken in Kherson and Zaporizhia, from Mariupol toward Odessa, but to go right from there to Moldova and link that all into territory that would be annexed to Russia. So Putin had a plan. It didn't work out, at least in the first year of the war. And the talk now is something going to happen, at this time. And like I said, it's really hard to know. My gut tells me it's a lot of talk, and Russia doesn't have the forces to use Moldova as a launching pad to go into Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to concentrate their forces on the Eastern Front in Donbass, where the most fighting is going on. Any other takeaways from the webinar earlier today? Well, Yulia Yurchenko, you really got to watch, what she said. It's very well said, and very powerful. She's on the street, and she felt, you could feel her. Next speaker was Vladislav Dubstev, who's also with Sociální Group, the socialist organization. His English is not as good as Yulia's, so you got to listen carefully. I would say the same for Kirill Medvedev, who is a Russian in the Russian socialist movement, who just escaped Russia recently. And his analysis, it's good, solid information. You get a sense of, how they view the war. But you got to listen more carefully. And then the next speaker was Kavita Krishnan from India. She was a member of the political committee of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation, which is one of three parties. The Communist Party covers the whole left in India, and they have various views. They have a lot of power in some regional governments like Kerala, but Kavita resigned from her party, which had the best position on Ukraine in terms of expressing solidarity, but wasn't acting on it. And she got really concerned that the left in India and around the world was confused about what international social solidarity means in this war. So she, as I was leaving, she was talking about the problems of the political situation in India. So that's as far as I got. And then the last speaker was going to be Bill Fletcher, who was, he led Trans-Africa toward the end of the anti-apartheid struggle and the years after. He's now involved in a solidarity movement with the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Western Sahara. When the AFL leadership changed after Lane Kirkland, he was a pretty high up in the AFL-CIO doing educational work. He writes a lot. I mean, Bill Fletcher Jr. You probably know him if you've been around the left. So he was going to wrap it up, and I'm going to go back and listen to what Kavita and he had to say at the end. So anyway, I think if you got the time, it goes for 90 minutes. If you don't have the time, please just listen to Yulia at the beginning of the podcast. It's a powerful statement. Well, while I'm waiting for the question, I see Vicky Corden. I also heard that Putin's war is also about LGBTQIA. He thinks he is purifying Russia from the ills of the West. I heard some leader of the Orthodox Church is helping him. Your thoughts? Yeah, that leader is the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is broken away from the rest of the Orthodox Church out of Constantinople, which is Istanbul, but they still call it Constantinople. The Ukrainian church broke away, and the leadership in Constantinople recognized it. And so the Russians are off on their own. And they're very conservative. And Putin's been saying that in his speeches, that, the speech, when did he start using Satanism? I think when he justified his speech about the annexations. He said, we're fighting Satanism. And what that really means is gay rights, feminism, the openness of, Western democracy. But they particularly focus on gay rights and trans rights. And, Putin postured, and when he talked about the annexations, that he was an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. And he spent a lot of time going through all the sins of Western imperialism, which were all true. He left out the Ottoman Empire, which had enslaved Slavs, particularly Ukrainians, for 2.5 centuries. At the same time, African slavery was going on. And then the Russian imperialism, the expansion and conquering of indigenous nations, going all the way east to the Bering Strait and the Pacific, much like the United States went west, manifest destiny, and oppress the indigenous nations. He left that part out. So he postured anti-colonial, and what he was saying is he's going to protect the whole colonial world from this threat of quote unquote Satanism that the West is promoting. So, it kind of gets absurd. I mean, he's now saying it's a bunch of gay Nazis in Ukraine that he's fighting, and it gets pretty silly. But the Orthodox Church is, that was sort of the ideological center of the Tsarist empire, and Putin has brought that back big, and in terms of and also getting the support of the top clergy in the Russian Orthodox Church. So that's part of his ideological justification for the war. And you can go read Putin's speeches. It's hard to do sometimes, but he really is coming from the far right. Rachel Mohan, I do think Russia is working to get a stronger foothold via Transnistria and is trying to further entrench there. That's just my feeling. My gut tells me they're stretched as it is in the Donbass in particular, where the fighting's going on. And I don't think they, from what I've been able to find out, their capacity is much diminished. This war is costing them a lot. And the scary thing is they're going on a war footing. They're militarizing their economy, and Putin is ready to keep throwing cannon fodder at the front and build up the arms industry so the artillery's there. But I don't think they're ready yet to start something in Transnistria. But again, that's my gut feeling as opposed to your gut feeling. So we'll see in time. It's 4 o'clock, and I appreciate the discussion on Ukraine. Let me just answer one more question from Linda Templin, which is in the chat on a totally different issue. On the state level, there is legislation to waste climate energy money on fake carbon capture technologies. Testifying in a legislative committee hearings is a great way to fight this. And Colorado has a hearing coming up. I saw Linda Templin. I thought she was going to talk about electoral reform, but she's right. This is an issue in the states and at the federal level. And these carbon capture technologies are being pushed as sort of a way of making amends for the fact that we're still emitting carbon. And even the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, scenarios assume that these technologies are going to play a big role from about 2050 on in reducing carbon in the atmosphere. When we should be doing is stopping the emissions now and then maximizing the natural sequestration of carbon through reforestation, rehabilitation of wetlands and mangroves, getting back to organic agriculture so the soil is alive, and that captures a lot of carbon in the soil ecosystem. That's the best way to bring carbon down. Now, I will say technically that may not be enough because we put so much carbon out there. The problem is right now the investment should be in renewable energy and energy efficiency, public transportation, those kinds of things, electrifying all transportation. Changing technology so that for example, steel manufacturing, heating the steel for different processes with green hydrogen instead of coke ovens. So there's a lot to do there. And then, once we've got the renewable energy system in place, then we can look at, how fast the natural sequestration is sequestering carbon and whether we need to do some additional technology. For example, putting carbonated water in basalt rock formations, and it solidifies this, carbonates in the rock, and is sequestered, geologically for eons. So, we may have to do that at some point, but, the fake carbon technology they're talking about now is, what they want to do is, for example, grab carbon out of, fossil fuel plants or even biofuel plants, and then ship that carbon to the oil fields, the Bakken oil field in North Dakota by pipelines. This is in the drawing boards, and push that into oil wells so you can push more oil out. That is not going to reduce carbon to the atmosphere. So there's a lot of phony stuff going on that, we need to get involved and oppose at the state level and also at the federal level. So I see Anna put in some of the other links. I'll just tell you a little bit about those articles. Let's see. First one, Alona Liashiba, she's another member of Sociální Ruch in Ukraine, the socialist organization. And I think that interview in Truth Out that came out yesterday is really worth a read. And you can see what, a Ukrainian socialist has to say about these issues. And then another one is Zakhar Popovich, who is also a Ukrainian in that socialist organization, Sociální Ruch. And Posley, where it's published, is a Russian leftist publication. So he was talking to the Russians, and, he has the kind of Leninist conclusion that, this war or Russia's imperialism is not going to end until they have fundamental social change in Russia. And that's kind of like Lenin saying, we got to turn this imperialist war into a civil war, a class struggle. And then Greg Palast, he goes into, as was mentioned in that earlier discussion, Putin's, he calls it Putin's Mein Kampf. That was his, his speeches that he's, used to justify his war in Ukraine. And, an invasion foretold. If you read particularly the essay he put out in it's 8,000 words in July 2021, he laid out this whole culture war rationale. It wasn't about NATO. It was about, the Russian world and Russian civilization and its conservative values versus the decadent West and so forth. So, and Greg Palast is a lively writer, so that's an easy article to read. And what was the other article that was in there? There was, I don't know if we got in the chat yet. Zachar, Greg Palast. No, 3 articles. Yep, they're all there. Okay, so no more questions are being put up because we try to keep this to an hour. But I saw a question, actually, the last one from Alan Mackey. What about you? What about what the Ukrainian communists have to say and the people of Donbass? Well, I think most of the people of Donbass have voted with their feet. They're out of Donbass. It's totally depopulated. The trade unions have been smashed. The government has been appointed by the Russians, replaced the elected government. The issues of language and culture were not really that severe. The ethnic conflict supposedly between the Russians and the Ukrainians, I mean, most of the ethnic Ukrainians were speaking Russian in that part of the country. And then, the language law passed, but it didn't ban Ukrainian. It just said you got to ban Russian. It said you got to use Ukrainian in official, public government functions, which maybe is not a good policy, but it didn't ban Russian speaking. And the Ukrainian communists, they have become, in the post-Soviet period, socially conservative, like Putin, Russian nationalists and imperialists, basically. And, in Ukraine, they're totally marginalized. The Ukrainian Communist Party, by that name, was banned back in 2014, along with, any party with a Nazi name. But then some more parties on the left. I mean, the communists still ran under other names in Ukraine, and some of those parties were banned. And I oppose that banning of the parties. The allegation from the government was they were engaged in espionage and treason on behalf of the Russian invasion. And I think you don't ban parties, you indict individuals who were doing that activity. So, and the Ukrainian communists really haven't been saying anything much different than what Putin and his circle have been saying. One of those parties, Baraba, which was ironically named for the left socialist revolutionaries during the Russian Revolution. That's what they call their party in Ukraine. That party, which was opposed to the Kyiv government and supported the separatists in Donbass, a tranche of emails between the Baraba leadership and the Kremlin were hacked and released a couple of years ago. So they really weren't an indigenous party, or at least they weren't a Ukrainian party. They were acting more as a Russian party. So I guess, I just sum up by saying, the party shouldn't have been banned. That's what Sotsialny Ruch, the socialist organization in Ukraine, says. But if people were engaged in espionage, they should be indicted on evidence of that and taken before the criminal justice system by legal processes individuals. So trade unions were smashed by Zelensky. They weren't smashed. They lost some rights in legislation that recently passed, and that was the whole parliament. This was neoliberal governments. They weren't smashed. Yeah, they were smashed in the Donbass under the occupation. and in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Talk to, and there's actually another webinar or podcast that went on today with the president of the Independent Miners Union of Ukraine. These people are exiled from Donbass. A lot of their members are fighting against the Russian invasion in Donbass, trying to get their land back. That's the working class opposition. And, they still function on the Ukrainian side of that contact line. They can't function on the Russian side. So let's call it a day here. We try to keep it to an hour so people don't feel it's a big obligation on Saturdays, or if they want to view it afterwards. So, we got everything posted. Did we get the the Ukraine Solidarity Network link posted? That is, people are trying to work in solidarity with the Ukrainian liberation struggle. There it is. There's a solidarity statement, or a statement of basically a mission statement for the Ukraine Solidarity Network. You can sign that and get involved in the network. And then Green Socialist Organizing Project, greensocialist.net, which is easy to remember, is who sponsored this video. And we're trying to, through mainly education at this point, but also hopefully more activity and organizing in the future, bring this eco-socialist perspective into the Green Party movement and the broader left. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week.